Great. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. Welcome to the last in the 2023 to 24 series of Material Digital Humanities seminars that are co-run by the University of London, the University of Cluj-Napoca, and Carleton University. We're very excited by this, our final seminar this year. We have Dr. Orly Lewis from Hebrew University Jerusalem, who is a senior lecturer in classics, and is going to talk to us about the materiality of interpretive 3D models. There'll be about 45 minutes, I think, of presentation, followed by plenty of time for discussion afterwards. And again, afterwards, feel free to ask your questions in the chat or to raise your hand, and we'll invite you to unmute and ask your question yourself. But I'll hand over to Orly. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Gabby, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Let me just share my screen. For some reason. Sorry, just a sec. We checked this before. And now. Yeah. Okay. Okay, you can see my screen, right?
Yes, yes.
Good, okay, so great. So thank you, and thanks everyone for being here today. So I'm going to throw you straight in to some text and some visuals, and we'll take it from there. So what we see here is a quote from Aristotle in the 4th century BC, so about 2,500 years ago, describing a very small excerpt from his long description of the heart. And he tells us, among other things, that the heart has 3 cavities, koiliae, and inside the cavities of the heart there are tendons, what he calls neura in Greek. And he tells us that the largest cavity is on the right side from the 3 cavities. The largest is on the right side, the smallest on the left, and the medium one in the middle. So I'm not sure what kind of image you already have in your mind, or how this is evolving while I was reading the text, but I would like to show you some visualization. What we are seeing here is the heart as we reconstructed it according to Aristotle's full description, so more extensive, but just to show you these koilia, these cavities. So we can see here the large ventricle, the large cavity on the right side. We can see the small cavity on the left side. We can see, we haven't hidden it here completely, you could see inside it. And here, if we look at the middle cavity, you can see the middle-sized one. And inside these cavities, you may have seen a bit, but you can see now better. We have these sort of tendons going in different directions throughout inside the cavities themselves. So this is a reconstruction of a 3D reconstruction of Aristotle's ideas of the heart, which we were viewing now. That was a screen capture of me viewing it on a dedicated interface that we developed in my lab, which is an atlas on which, as you could see, you could view the 3D model, the 3D reconstruction that we created, and explore various data, not only explore the visuals from different directions and the different parts, but also see some extra information, some additional information. For instance, I don't know if you noticed, but the terms were popping up in transliteration with the translation, so you had some context. This was, I only showed you some of the features of some of the information that you can see, but it already gave you hopefully some idea of and connection to the text that you were seeing. that we read together at the beginning, and you may have some questions about it. You may want to explore further. One thing you might want to be thinking about is perhaps whether you would like to take this 3D model outside of the virtual world. For instance, sorry, I think just someone drew on the slide, so if they can also delete it, because I'm not sure that I can. Just so it doesn't come across. Yeah, I think someone popped up as Victoria. So sorry about this, but if you could delete the illustrations, the markings, that would be great. So what you're seeing here is a 3D print, so a physical, actual material 3D print of the model that we were viewing digitally, virtually in the atlas. You can see it sort of cut in the middle and opened. You can't see all the 3 cavities in this view. You can see the large one and the middle-sized one. It's also in a different color, but this is a physical object, which is a representation of the same model we were seeing. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk about the research leading to this 3D model, the context of why are we reconstructing and creating 3D models of ancient anatomical ideas, and how we are doing this, the work methods and workflow we are using. And then I'll move to considering, in light of when we're thinking of these 3D models, considering questions regarding the materiality of these models, both from the perspective of their origins and from the perspective of their application. So how we can use in the research, or what these actual models in research, outside research have become, and this connecting us more directly to the themes of the seminar here. I just would like to note that later in the presentation, I do have a couple of photos from dissections. You'll understand soon why and what these dissections are. I've tried to keep them as sort of kind of not too graphic as possible, but I apologize if for anyone this is a bit uncomfortable. Of course, you know, these are temporary slides and then we'll move on. So if you're uncomfortable, we'll pass, you know, you can reopen your eyes once we continue, so it's not a prominent part. So ancient anatomical ideas. The work that you've seen was performed and is still being performed in my lab, which is funded currently by an ERC project, ERC starting grant, which deals with anatomy in ancient Greece and Rome, with the idea and the vision of creating this interactive visual and textual atlas. So when we talk about ancient anatomy, so the term as such, when we talk about anatome, we already recognize the term. It's very similar to the term we use as anatomy. So this body of knowledge, so this knowledge about the body, the theory. In ancient Greece, in ancient Greek, it also meant the actual cutting and opening of the body in order to gain this theoretical knowledge. So dissection, vivisection as well, mainly on animals, but for a short period also on humans. But as you can see, I have quite a few pictures here, but there are many more people we should and could be talking about in antiquity, because unlike today, where anatomy, the anatomical ideas are fairly standardized. So we have any textbook of anatomy you would open today, wherever you learn anatomy in any country or university, we have in fact many anatomies. So so unlike today, where we have this sort of one single anatomy, in antiquity we have to talk and think in terms of many anatomies. So each author who is researching and exploring the anatomy and writing about it usually has his own ideas. Sometimes they're very similar to ideas of other researchers in antiquity. Sometimes they're very different. Sometimes the overlap is not entirely clear because also the terminologies we have, each of these authors is expressing the anatomy in their own terminology, which also has some overlap. So the terminology is not always entirely clear. We can have one term referring to different parts, or one part being referred to by different terms. So there's a lot to disambiguate and to research and understand, but we do have, and this is part of the complexity, but we do have very rich sources. So we have dozens of textual sources, and these are really treatises dedicated to anatomical ideas, or in which anatomy is very prominent. And of course, anatomy, as in any culture, is present in metaphors, in daily life, in daily expressions, in literature sources, and so forth. So anatomy is not just constrained and restricted to the scientific sphere. What we do in our project is to explore this anatomy and to reconstruct the ideas and to understand the ideas in these texts. So we study these texts to understand how the Greeks and Romans not only understood the body, how they investigated it, how they described the body and the structure of the body, the anatomical structures, but also how these ideas that they had, the research they were doing, and the research methods they were using, and the terminology they were using, how the interaction between these three fields of ideas, research methods, and terminology in antiquity, how they shaped one another. And also looking at the anatomical text as a textual genre, and trying to understand the conventions in anatomical descriptions, which also, of course, relates to understanding the content and what we would expect while reading the text. And the team is composed not only of textual researchers, of classicists. We also have some Arabists, since quite a bit of our material has been lost in Greek, but we have it in early Arabic translations from the 9th century. But in addition to the sort of what one would expect, the textual researchers, we also have on the team working daily together the anatomy experts, mainly from the veterinary field, because of the animal origin and sources in the ancient research. We have 3D experts, professional 3D modelers, and we have product experts, data scientists, software developers. And what I'll do now is explain how we work towards, from these sort of texts, from that, as you saw, the text and description from antiquity, how we reached it to the model, how we get to the model and other models that we have created, and also explicitly how we get to having it on the digital atlas, and not just having this 3D model, but actually an interface which connects the model to its data and allows anyone to explore it easily. So I'll go through the sort of key research stages of from the textual analysis and translation to the anatomical deciphering and interpretation, and to the 3D modeling, and then I'll move on to the atlas, and then to the questions that we want to be thinking about today. So we begin with the ancient text. So here we have in Greek, but I mentioned we have sources also in Arabic, also in Latin. The first stage is translating the text, which, as I'm sure many of you know from your own work, translating is already first stage of interpretation, and already it requires us to deal with terminological considerations, philological considerations, and making already interpretive decisions on what the meaning of the text is, also with respect to the content and the very technical anatomical content. Translating it also into English is not only part of the research process as is, the interpretive process, it is also what facilitates the interdisciplinary discussion with the team members, with all team members, so also those who don't know one of the earlier languages, the classical Arabic, the Greek, the Latin, and as well as whether they're textual people or, of course, our anatomy experts, our 3D modelers, and so forth. So this is really the initial stage, which allows us to continue. And part of the work on this analysis is also performed through computational means. I won't go into this very much today, but it will return when we are thinking on some of the questions a bit later. So I will touch upon this a bit, but we do a lot of tagging. We built a tagging environment in Inception, if some of you may know this very useful interface, which was developed by a team and is still being developed. So we use it to mark various points, including categories which are relevant to the anatomy. And based on this translation, which is, as I said, is aided with by the computational methods, we move to the next stage of the anatomical deciphering with the experts who are experts in modern anatomy, which means that they know the body as they help us bridge the gap to the body. So, of course, as classicists and textual researchers, historians of medicine, we are very used to and we're trained in reading texts and interpreting the text, but most of us have not looked inside the body, while the authors that we are researching had looked constantly and repeatedly in the bodies, and this is what is reflected in their texts. And we have to bridge this gap. So it's through this joint discussion, rather than just sending off the text and waiting for some clear-cut answers from the experts. It's really through discussion that we decipher the anatomy and the anatomical picture in this particular text. And all the time, the ancient text is leading us in the discussion. And here we have the English translation, which is allowing us all to have a discussion, but the textual researcher is always continuously through the discussion returning to the ancient Greek, to the ancient language, or Latin, or the Arabic, in order to realize the nuances, try to understand, because it's an iterative process. It's not just a linear, but once we have this discussion with the anatomical experts, we are starting to understand what we had glossed over, or things that we didn't even understand that we were glossing over while reading the text and just translating it into another language. So we do this through discussion and through the expertise and knowledge of the anatomy experts, and through literature in the field, but we also do this through actual experimental hands-on dissections, and you can see lots of papers around us. It's because we have very detailed manuals that we write based on the ancient texts, especially when we reach the Galen in the 2nd century CE. Galen left us very detailed instructions of how to dissect, so we can really try to reenact, and this is an important part of the project, to reenact the way Galen was dissecting and trying to view the body as closely as possible as he is telling us to view it and to cut it. But we can perform sometimes these dissections also in order to, based on the questions which are arising from, for instance, the Aristotelian text, and Aristotle doesn't tell us how to dissect, but he tells us what he is seeing. So trying to open the body and to try and see, even if today in modern anatomy we don't recognize a particular part, to try and see what Aristotle is seeing, or to understand based on what he is describing this. So this is, again, constantly improving and our translation and our interpretation of the text and understanding of the anatomical ideas, the terms and the terminology. With this sort of improved, so just to mention that, and this will be relevant later, that a lot is going on during our work in the lab. We're taking notes constantly in order to document what we've been doing, but not only document through 3D scanning and filming, but also by answering particular questions that we had written up that we knew we want to understand, because we realized that later on we might not remember what was going on and what we observed and what we understood during the dissection. So with this improved, and this again, it's improving constantly our understanding of the text, and with this improved translation, we move to the 3D modeling, the creation of the 3D model. And what does that mean? So the first stage is creating a table of instructions for the 3D modelers, telling them what, based on this sort of already detailed deciphering and interpretation of the text, what needs to be in the model, how it should look. You can see here a sort of excerpt from our table of instructions for a model on Aristotle's digestive system, not the heart. You can see a mixture of Greek transliterated terms with English terms. You can see these are closed rows. They're much longer, each cell, of instructions for the model of what to draw. We mark what the source is, how much is based on just the text or our interpretation. Sorry, and we mark already commentary, questions that we already have arising, and the particular reference. And you can note here, sorry. 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 Different liquids to remedy the throat, different temperatures. I'm sure it's ancient medicine would agree. So you may have seen at the end of the table also some already words in Greek. Some of you may have noticed the names of the columns of word and lemma. All this is connected to our database. I'll mention this later, but this already connects us. This table is connected to what we were seeing from the tagging database and the text that we were tagging. This we can see through this table the beginning of the connection between the visuals and the text, not in terminology and in the references, and things will emerge. I'll say more about this soon. So once we have the table of instructions, the modelers can get to work, and this is just to show a bit of what it means to model and create a model based on the instructions through different modeling software. The modelers use different softwares for different stages, for the actual sort of sculpturing, for refining some of the details, for adding the textures, and really creating the model according to the instructions as required by us researchers, based on the interpretation of the text, which, as I mentioned, was joined and not just through the classical textual perspective. And you can already see the colors being emerging, different parts being put together and being separated and being put together, which is what allows us later in the atlas to take, for you as users, to take apart and observe different parts based on the different rows in the table of instructions. Our modelers know what parts need to be separated and where, and how they should be called in order for a user to see the terms that we want them to see and connect them to the text. So as I mentioned, these are professional modelers creating the image, the visual, and this 3D model from scratch, so to speak. I mean, we haven't done photogrammetry, as probably, I assume most of you know the term, but sort of scanning with an object, as we might do with an archaeological material find. But we're taking the text and turning it in a way back into 3D, since, as I mentioned, much of what is expressed in words and in this sort of very one-dimensional format of words actually derives from observations and of the 3D, of the three-dimensional body in antiquity. So once we have the model already, we are stage forward, so to speak. But the modeling itself, this process of writing the table of instructions, and then once we have this initial draft model, that begins the discussion between the modeler and the text researcher, which again throws us back into the text, into different nuances. But already from the beginning, from when we are creating that table of instructions, we need to make decisions and go back to the text and stand and what is being said and decide how we are interpreting it in a way that we would not have had to do if we were just translating. So that's why we may have not done it at the first stage, although now we are much more experienced. We already know what to expect and where these pitfalls lie. But if we are just translating and expressing in words, just in a paraphrase or a different language, what the ancient text was telling us, we wouldn't have to make decisions that are required in a 3D environment. So, for instance, if we have a text saying that the vessel splits near the ear, or it extends from the spleen, we might be asking where exactly near the ear, how far, what direction from the ear. If the vessel extends from the spleen, where from the spleen? The spleen is a 3D part in the body. It has a back, a front, two sides, or more, depends how you consider sides. It can be further up and can be in the middle. It can be from the bottom. When Aristotle talks in a different text about fatty and fibrous bonds which connect the heart to the windpipe, what do these look like? How and where, in which direction do they connect these parts? So we have, you can see here some interpretations some visual interpretations that we already made in the relevant models. And as I said, there are interpretations and there are various questions that you as users and researchers using our models when reading the text or trying to learn on ancient anatomy, you may have some questions arising if you're coming from the text and reading such a sentence. You may have different questions if you haven't read the text and you're just exploring the model for different reasons. So we end up with a model, and we already have quite a few models. These are just a selection. Some of these already earlier versions that have been updated, both visually and in detail, because of the continuous research and the iterative process, and some feedback from colleagues. And the question is, what do we do with them? How do we make them available to other scholars, of course, also to students and the public, but how do we make them useful? How do we make all of them available and available in the way that is that users need them to be available? So if we are a researcher, if you're just one person may be just happy looking at the model and seeing and interpreting it in their own eyes, but our sort of core users, our immediate kind of audience, which are researchers of the ancient texts or history of medicine in later periods or other cultures which were engaging with the ancient ideas and texts, might be asking other difficult questions on our interpretation. We would like to have a much clearer connection between the text, between the terminology. So we understood that this has to be, these models need to be made available in such a way that answers all these requirements and needs of, first and foremost, researchers, but of course also in broader context of teaching and other kinds of engagements. So for this reason, we developed the Atlas. And the question is, what does the interface look like? How is it built? How do we embed the models in the Atlas, answering all these needs, providing all the needs of researchers. The development of the interface of the Atlas, since we are in a Digital Humanities forum, I assume some of you are engaged with these kind of projects or thinking about these kind of questions and realizing that how much developing an research interface or an interface for presenting our research results is part of the research and requires us again to reflect upon our text, reflect upon our research methods, reflect upon what scholars require from us. What does it mean to move into the digital world when presenting research results? So this is why we also have a product manager, which has been with us from the first day, actually, of the project, insofar that from the first thing we were doing was beginning to develop the interface and performing an extensive user research with all the tools that, product thinking and user research. These are concepts which are entering now into the humanities and academic research, but they have a longer and more in-depth history in the industry, so outside academia, and bringing in this kind of theoretical framework and methodological tools has allowed us to work towards and to create an interface that we are seeing that in which our researchers, our core audience, and slowly expanding these circles, are involved in the development process, in the design process, and are helping us to understand what needs to be done in order for us to tailor it, not only for what we in the project might think, but really what they require, and not working for 5 years to this kind of golden or the sort of holy grail of an interface, and then discovering that it's not what people need, but it's what we thought people need. So even our interface, what you saw in the video where I was showing you at the beginning the model, even this homepage has undergone many it's gone several stages of development and improvements based on this feedback, and we're now working also towards, I'll mention this point soon as well, but we're working towards a new version with improvement of certain tools and some new tools, again based on this kind of third round of user research and feedback that we were performing. So some of the features that the interface includes, in order to answer and address these needs of researchers, in order to make these models more than just a 3D model, or in order to make them useful research resources or sources, that's a question, one of terminology. You saw some of these tools, for instance, the ability to, at the bottom left, this kind of fan of possibilities in the viewing context, of hiding a certain part, or zooming in, or isolating it, fading it in order to see inside, but still in context. At the bottom right, you can see what you also saw in the video of by hovering, you can see the Greek term and transliteration. This allows anyone to at least understand the term, even if they don't know Greek. And of course, sometimes we have only the Arabic term or the Latin. So the transliteration creates a common language, even if it's more phonetic language. But of course, for those knowing the language, it already gives some idea. But we also have the translation, which is our interpretation, of course, in brackets so one can understand how we're translating the term. At the top right is this I didn't show in the video already. This is a kind of information box you would reach if while still viewing the model, if you click on a particular part, for instance, the part called fleps in Greek. This is what's written here. You can see this through the transliteration in blue. When you click on this part, you will get a short description here already while you're still looking at the model, so you can go between different parts and getting some idea of what this part actually is. You could click on full details, which would take you to a long page where you would have the information, various etymological research information about the term and its meaning in different authors and different periods. And at the end of each kind of this sort of lexical entry page, you can also find a list of references. Here we can see 3 out of, for this term, which is also still this same flaps. We actually have 74 references. I just screen captured 3. And you can see where exactly, in which text, and exactly for those who have some eye for these kind of codes of us classicists of the referencing system. But again, this is already more for the expert user who is trying to reach to the text. It speaks in their language with the Greek sort of sentence from our database. And also the particular translation of this term in this particular passage. And you can see that it may vary according to the text or to the textual reference. What you can see here is, this is, for instance, a recent feature that we added based on feedback from our users who said they would like to search inside these references. And so suddenly this very important but kind of particular, kind of restricted feature that we had of list of references that we knew was very useful, but we didn't think about expanding it. From our users, we made it into a very interactive tool in itself, because you can filter here, you can search for particular terms and organize it as you wish. And this is now, again, we'll be asking for more round of feedback based on this, and with room for further development. I was just going to say something which, sorry, I lost my train of thought. But what I wanted to say is that all of this information and the references is entered automatically into our atlas and presented in this way that we understood was the useful way. It's done automatically from our database, which is a table of terms. I'll show you a bit of it in a moment, but which derives from that same tagging we saw at the beginning of the particular terms. What we tag is drawn throughout the code we developed automatically into a set of tables, a relational database for those of you who deal with databases. This is then extracted by a further code into our atlas and presented in a way which is more useful than we believe, but also from the feedback we are getting, much more useful than from a tabular form of presentation, and of course allows you to search in our database without having to deal with tables and another different kind of interface. And what is also good about this is that even we have already over 1,000 lexical entries, over 1,000 lemmata, so in various languages. And we have not managed to yet write this sort of short description explaining the term for each of them, of course, because that's based on quite a lot of work. We are expanding it and adding all the time. But even if you go into a lemma page, which doesn't have this short description, you'll already have the references, because this is all automated and doesn't require further work. Besides the data entry, which we were performing through the annotation. And again, part of that is also automated. Another important point, and this brings us back to the 3D, is what we're calling for now the model page, which presents the power data, another term that some of you may know, the additional information explaining the 3D, explaining the model. And you can see this is taken from the digestive system according to Aristotle, which you'll soon see in a different context. And you can see here a list of the parts with a short discussion, and then a detailed discussion of each of the parts, the sources on which it's based, our explanation, sorry, I'm running a bit quickly here, but our explanation of each of the parts and our interpretation with some commentary on particular issues that we found interesting, or we know have been of interest in the research, some bibliography for further reading, and so forth. So this is ready for those who are interested in a sort of critical engagement with the model. This allows you to really understand our voice here and our interpretation and the basis for each part and decision in the model. So allowing for the transparency and allowing also for reproduction of a critical engagement of arguing with us. And it gives us all the tools for creating these sort of footnotes and qualifications that one may have felt slightly uncomfortable with when they were looking at the model and sort of saying, well, how come this is this size, or this is connected in this at this point? Because as I was saying, there were so many interpretive stages along the way. So the way we are creating this transparency and which our interface allows us to, but it begins through our workflow, through the automation of the database and creating a very detailed database. You can see a very small excerpt of a very detailed table which has many more columns, and is drawn. The information is drawn automatically from our tagging environment in Inception, which has the full reference with the word before and word after, which has some research interest, the quote as we determine it, some category types, the translations, the lemma. We are connecting also between Greek lemmata and the Arabic translation when we know to identify them. And of course, this is the sort of, in a way, the back end, sort of the backbone even of the atlas. This is where all the references you saw before originates. And the workflow, the transparency continues with the modeling, the instruction table, where we are ready, while we are writing the instructions, we are also documenting per instruction, per decision, per part, our, as you saw before, our commentary, our uncertainties, the level of certainty that we have for each part, in order for us to then always maintain and document these the stages in the research and uncertainties which allow us to then write the model page in a careful way, and to make sure that the questions for researchers are answered or addressed as much as possible. Also, when we perform the dissections, which will also soon be online with a lot of information and connected between text and visuals, and our interpretation. And also then, as you saw before, you can see here another example. I'm sorry, just trying to, there's much more going on from documentation, but these are the less graphic photos that we are documenting all the time by different means, in order to make sure, and with different numbers, in order to make sure that it's related to each part. We know exactly what it's referring to in the body is referring to in the text. Now, when thinking of the materiality of all this, so when we're thinking of the sources of the 3D model in the atlas, so we have the textual, the basis, so to speak, for us is the textual source, which is the ancient text. But at the same time, we have brought in the material, a material source, which is the body itself, and particularly the dissected body that we recreated according to, as much as possible, according to the ancient texts. So this, one could ask, this is a material source in so fact that it's something material and physical, but it's not the kind of traditional material source that we would think about, because it's not a primary source, so to speak. We have recreated we created even this source based and in a sort of intelligent way, insofar in an academic way, based on our research, but still recreated it. But here you can see, part of what one can do during a dissection is, for instance, explore the three-dimensionality and start thinking of what it means that there's a cavity and where these different cavities are. From the other perspective, the converse perspective, is what happens once we have this 3D model. So what kind of source or resource is it? A source? Is it a resource for? Is it for other scholars, for students? It's the virtual. We saw the virtual model in the atlas, but we also have this physical object that we can manipulate and explore, allowing us to perform experiments on it that might help us better understand or test our interpretation. We can also do various visual experiments that we've been experimenting with, or for instance, if we're thinking of the stomach here, to try and understand what it means that the stomach expands and contracts according to our text. And there are questions here that one begins to ask, or more complex animation that we created in order to try and show, this is already moving into physiology, of what happens when the food is digested according to Aristotle. But here it's already based on the anatomy that we have and created. We're already adding additional layers of interpretation and of understanding of the text and the motion of the food through the stomach and late into the body. Just to say before concluding, with thinking, part of some of the features that we are planning and some of them we're already working on for the atlas are related exactly to these kind of questions of transparency and and connecting this visual and this material aspect to the textual, of creating a sort of visual apparatus of showing the different interpretations visually, adding a certainty layer, which has begun. We have some applications of this in archaeology that some of you probably familiar with, adding the feedback button. So this is already moving us into already if it's a source, if it's a scholarly resource and source for other scholars, where does the peer review and discussion between us and our peers come in, and how and we would like to create these features that allow, these are fairly simple ones, of create like a feedback button, which is almost there, but thinking more in a more complex way about a structured external peer review for the different models. And so in form of conclusion and to open the discussion, there are quite a few questions that one may ask, but some of the things which even when you may have noticed when I'm talking about this, but certainly in the context of our research today, and where academic research is with respect to peer review, with respect to assessment of scholars' research, evaluation of us as scholars of the field, of our institutions, there are various questions which arise about this materiality of the models and what they are. And some questions relate to the terms that we use. I mean, do we sort of try and copy terms that we are familiar with in order to give and do we do, for instance, using 3D addition, which is something that in the pure 3D, for instance, work lab in the Netherlands, we can see that these terms being developed and emerging and slowly being more and more integrated into scholarship. But do we need to use these terms which are more familiar, like an addition? Do we want to move to other terms? What is useful? What is in a way correct and useful for us as scholars and for our peers, and also in this context of trying to make our terminology kind of related. We have these innovative kind of 3D visuals emerging, of course, in cultural heritage as well. But on the one hand, the results are and the means of presenting are very innovative, but often our terminology is a bit more traditional. And sometimes I think this traditional can be very useful. Sometimes there is a question of whether it restricts us in thinking more broadly. And one also may ask, okay, so we have this 3D visual, we have all the power data and the model page, which is very scholarly and a lot of text and written. Do we also need to publish an article which goes into a peer-reviewed journal or even a book chapter in order to anchor this, in order to give something additional, or did this come instead? And of course, then the question which is always looming and is the question of the peer review and how to do this on the 3D models and ones which are published on an interface, how to do it and when to do it, at what stage, especially with something which is so iterative, and of course you have additional versions and different versions emerging once people start using it. So in articles, we cannot always show all the different versions, but the digital interface could allow us to show the different versions on the way. So with that, I'll end. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much to my team, whose work you've just saw. And yeah, that's it for now. Thank you. I'll stop the share.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Orly. That was fascinating and rich and thorough as always. I always feel the one slight shame from a virtual meeting like this is that we don't get the several seconds of the sort of white noise of everyone applauding at the end of it. But please imagine that. We enjoyed that very much.
Thank you very much.
So yes, if anyone would like to ask any questions or make any comments based on that, please feel free to either ask your question in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll invite you to turn your video on and unmute and ask it yourself. The thing that occurred to me several times in your presentation, Orly, was I mean, in my notes, the word sustainability turns up about 3 or 4 times. Most recently, when you were talking about, do you need a print article or the peer-reviewed article in addition to this database? And one reason that people might say that is useful is precisely for sustainability. With the best will in the world, the website with all of this very rich material in cannot be guaranteed to remain available forever. A peer-reviewed article is much easier to sort of keep that available. So that's sort of one possibility. That of course leads to your question of how the material in the database is made available to people reading the article, and effectively your database is one of your sources in your footnotes to your article, right? I mean, when you make a point you make in your article will almost always be backed up by the data in your database, in your 3D models, in your website. And if the sustainability of that falters in any way, does that risk creating sort of dead links in the footnotes, as it were? So I don't know that sort of bigger question about
Yeah.
about sustainability.
Mhm.
One of the things people sometimes talk about. Sorry, I'm sort of making this into a question, which I'll throw back to you. But one of the things people think about in terms of sustainability, especially when you've got a site like this, where the interface is so rich and is such an important part of what's being delivered, is that one aspect of sustainability is making the raw data available with as much documentation as possible, so that when your website goes down, because it's not if, right? It's when, people can still use a lot of that material. So yeah, I wonder whether you had any thoughts about sustainability and the various ways it intersects with other things you've been talking about.
It's thank you so much for that, because it's interesting that I actually didn't mention sustainability, which I often do. In so far that there are many things to say here. So let me say briefly with sort of headlines, and then we can follow up if you would like. One point is that involving this product thinking, so the product manager, and involving this framework of product thinking is exactly the issue of sustainability, which is related to usability and so forth. But sustainability in so far that part of what the vision is beyond Greco-Roman anatomy. One could go even beyond anatomy. We already saw a bit of physiology, but beyond, these concepts, but beyond Greco-Roman into other periods, other cultures. So we always have in mind. We keep returning to the issue of interface as research. So decisions about interface being related to the research. We have questions about, okay, would this work also with other kinds of languages, or characters? We already have 3 different types of characters. We have the Greek, the Arabic, the Latin. But thinking of, if we move to comparison to the Far East and so forth, and would some of the database decisions also, would they be sustainable in a way, or relevant also for these other cultures and other researchers? Because part of the idea is that this can have an afterlife and sustainability, not only through my work or the work of colleagues that I could pass it on because they get new funding and so forth, but also through projects from other fields which are related and could take it up. That's one aspect. Another aspect is creating and trying to create the change on the institutional level, which, as we all know, is always a challenge and is related to questions of the peer review and the terminology, and how much is it proper research and so forth. In order to at least create a system where we could to make sure it's always available and always online, even if we are not adding new content, and it becomes this kind of outdated, horrible idea of this becoming outdated, but it would, or bug fixes, to make sure that it is always accessible through at least some unit. And this also depends on different universities, how advanced they are in creating this kind of unit, which could help other projects. A third just point is the idea is that the raw data is always there. And because of this very careful documentation, we reflect it through the atlas, but supposedly, this evaporates for whatever reason, or becomes unusable, then we could always revert back to takeout tables. They're not Excel. We work in a particular in the digital environment, but take them. And for instance, what we're now doing with the dissections, we're deciding, before we're making the dissection materials, before going into a very long development and design process for a very complex interface, we're saying, let's make it available in the sort of most basic way, but useful and encouraging engagement. And then hear what people have to tell us about how they would like it to look. But there you would see more of the raw data, for instance, in the kind of raw way. So I hope that begins to answer some of these concerns.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah. We've got a couple of comments in the chat. Kostas, did you want to unmute and say a little bit about your point about your 3D work at all? You can also just read out the comment if you prefer. So in the meantime, so Kostas said thank you very much. Really enjoyed the work. He mentions, yes, that in the Pure 3D project that they're doing, which I believe is in the Netherlands, they're working on related. So a lot of the issues that you raise, including the issue of peer review models for 3D, which might be worth future conversations.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thanks for that. And I'm aware of the project, and also through through other venues, and definitely great. Thank you very much for that. I'll be in touch.
Ines also has a question in the chat asking if, for example, you find different details in Greek and Arabic sources, presumably on the same source for a piece of anatomy. Feel free to unmute Ines if you want to further clarify. But I guess the question is if you have different sources that contradict each other on a particular model of a particular piece of anatomy, how do you record that within your data?
Okay, so let me answer if I understand the question. And of course, whoever asked it, I'm sorry I didn't catch the name, but can follow up if that wasn't the direction. So I think the question is actually relevant even regardless of the Arabic, because as is the case in Greco-Roman antiquity, is that already there we have different descriptions of the heart, and I showed it on one of the slides, but didn't mention this. You saw the heart that you had already seen of the Aristotelian one, but you also had a different heart there which doesn't open because it's from a different text which doesn't talk about the internal structures. And this question is exactly the kind of initial motivation in many respects of this research, insofar that we want to show and put out the different anatomies, the different understanding, the different hearts, for instance, the different stomachs and digestive systems. And working also, I mean, part of what we would want to do is to create a comparative feature, which we're already thinking of in the atlas, so you could see the different hearts and compare them. And this is what I mentioned before, moving into other cultures. We would want people working on the later sources, for instance, medieval Muslim sources or any other culture to work through with us, or to sort of pick up our method and workflow to create the models, and then hopefully keep it still on the same interface to allow this comparative. It might be that the question also regarded, so the Arabic text that we're working with are translations of they're not original Arabic texts of medieval times, but they're translations of the Greek text. It's just that part of them we have lost substantial parts in Galen, for instance. We only have them in the ancient Arabic. And part of our research is to already build, and this is of course building on Greco-Arabica research, which is we're not the first to do, obviously, building on the methods of correlating between terms, so that using, we have texts and passages which we have both the Greek and the Arabic translation, using them in order to correlate between how a certain term in Greek is translated into Arabic, so that for the places where we only have the Arabic, we can hopefully very carefully kind of understand what was the Greek. And this is part of why our database is trying to connect between these things, and it's not available yet entirely on the atlas, but we're working hard on this now. For each Greek term that we have, if we know the exact translation of the Arabic into Arabic of that term, or especially in that passage, to make that also available, because this is for those dealing with this kind of transmission of knowledge. As you know, it's a very tricky world that with very limited digital availability of search tools. We don't have an Arabic TLG, so like a digital database for searching in the text. So trying to help and make this as useful, provide as many tools and information as possible, even if it's for people who are not specifically working on our text.
Yes, I mean, another possibility is that you would have two different manuscript sources for the same passage of text. The piece of Galen, for example, even if they're not one in Greek, one in Arabic, it could be two in Greek that have manuscript variants that might, depending on how you read them, might make a material difference to your model. I mean, we sometimes talk about paradata as being the apparatus criticus of a 3D model, but in this case, we're literally talking about an apparatus criticus, which more literally than I normally think of the term.
We have encountered. So we're fortunate to be working from editions. So the manuscripts have been collated, but so we have our sort of default edition, the edition from which we're working, but we have encountered points where we do not agree with that reading. And the place to, currently the place where this is reflected is a bit in the references, but usually in the model page, in this model information page. But we would want to add this with a more visual layer of certainty, and I think this has again been done a bit in archaeology, and I think the Pure 3D Lab has also had some interesting information about that, and the work of Chiara Piccoli, I think, has also touched upon it. So some of these concepts are there in cultural heritage, even if they're not being applied widely yet, but they are there, but have not been, moved on into other fields, which where 3D is less prominent still. And some of what we are doing is also sometimes there are other ways in which we can already on the visual 3D viewing platform give you some of that information, but there's always the balance of how much do we want to clutter, so to speak, the 3D, because we have different kinds of users. And because not only that, even an expert user sometimes wants the clean model and then move towards it. But this is what the digital interface, why it's such a useful tool and a way of thinking of how to present our research. Because it allows us all this flexibility without having to always decide for the user, for the audience, what they need and how they want to go about using the material and the resource.
Ines, did that answer your question?
I hope so. A long, undulating answer.
I had a very minor question. Your list of sources, which you said your automatically generated list of sources in your text, does that list include dictionaries? Because that would further, make it less necessary for you to have your annotation in them before they're useful to people.
So do you mean in the list of what I was calling the list of references?
References,
we also
exactly.
refer, for instance, to the Liddell and Scott entry. So the list of references gives you places in the text that use the term and the exact context, sort of a concordance and the exact translation. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of what you're asking because it's leading me to. So, and as I said, what we're doing is trying to create our own lexical entries, which are based on the research and this ambiguation. And what you're suggesting is to, at least in places where we haven't yet managed to do the research to write the lexical entry, to at least maybe include a link to the Liddell and Scott, or maybe even a reproduction, if possible, as a kind of some information.
There are open versions of the Liddell Scott or and of other dictionaries. I mean, I was thinking. I mean, actually, even where you do have that, your own sort of description and interpretation and whatever in there, having a link to or a small import of some of the data from, for example, Logaon or some similar site, which enables you to find sort of co-references and co-locations, and things like that occur in with this word in other texts. How is this word used in texts that are not medical texts, etc. Would just be somewhere else for people to go and explore that might be of some people's interest.
Yeah, because we do have we call it the lemma page, so the page which is the lexical entry. I didn't show it. I think sort of to the end, but I could show how it's built. But it's a page where the references are actually at the end. You have a short description, maybe a longer description, a kind of more essay. You have links to the models, to the visuals with this term, and some references, sort of a list of which sources mention it and so forth. But also at the end, we have bibliography of kind of, if we know, also sometimes not just the dictionary, there might have been articles written on this particular term. So perhaps what you're suggesting could be integrated into either into the bibliography, or even creating a new section in these lemma pages, which is like cross references to other dictionaries and resources. So yeah, thanks for that. We'll think of that. I'll run it by everyone. Thank you.
And one final thing, I think we're almost out of time, but final. I think this comment includes a question from Ines, although I haven't read it all the way through yet. She's says, focusing on 3D models, not only interesting, very important to understand the past, especially with history and archaeology, as you've said. Do you have any information about those fields? And I'm not sure what those fields refers to. I guess the so I mean the fields in the database, or the use of 3D in history and archaeology. Sorry, how do you read that question in history and archaeology?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big. I mean, I think that's a big question. Which I mean, what I could say about this is that actually in the field, especially of archaeology, moving in more into history, depending what kind of history, and there's more of already I wouldn't say a tradition, that's not the word, but more work being done in 3D for in recent years. So in a way, there's still a theoretical framework still needs to be set down, a methodological framework, but there is quite a lot of stuff, especially in archaeology, because of the cultural heritage. And I think obviously it has many more applications in kind of public engagement and in archaeology, much more initiating, from earlier stages, bringing in the 3D, also from because of you have the material object to scan, and raising sometimes different kind of questions, but sometimes similar questions to this kind of 3D modeling, which is based without something to scan in a way, or without the primary material source, so to speak. So there is a lot of information out there that one can get at, and part of what I would like to see happening is bringing 3D much more into other fields besides archaeology and the cultural heritage sphere.
Thank you very much again. Well, I think we should probably stop there. We can virtually or physically applaud and thank Orly again.
Thank everyone very much for the questions. Thank you, Gabby, for the.
Thank you.